Hi, welcome to a new episode in the Internet Surfer, hosting the most horror and creepiest stories from Reddit. Please don't forget to comment, like, share, and subscribe. Enjoy.
Reddit. What is your most disturbing, scary, or creepy real story? Serious, episode 13. My cousin Jay and his wife had a bad stretch in their lives and had to move in with some relatives. Her uncles flipped houses professionally and had recently purchased some cheap property in an old suburb of Toronto. This one gives me chills because they are very reasonable, not superstitious people. I didn't believe it at first, but my cousin is a big, strong guy, a heavy engine mechanic, and he seemed terrified after he told me this, so I don't know what to believe. It had an extra bedroom and heating, so Jay and they moved in and lived on the ground floor with their 2 cats. Things were pretty normal for 4 months until the uncles decided to rescue 2 more cats, bringing the total to 4. It was light at first. They'd hear weird noises at night sometimes and things would go missing, jewelry and the like, but they would pop up. Jay is kind of absent-minded, so it's not unlike him to move it and forget about it. However, things started to escalate in the weird department shortly after the 2 new cats were brought in. The cats would gather in a semicircle and hiss at the door to the basement. One time they started yowling so loud it woke people up, but they all scattered with Jay and they went to check it out. The cats would do this at night regularly after a while, hissing/yowling at the basement door late at night. They thought maybe rats were in basement, so the uncles called in an exterminator and they laid down poison/traps. After the exterminator finished his work, he made a comment about keeping the cats out of the basement. But all 4 of them realized that despite the door being open, sometimes they never recalled seeing the cats cross the basement threshold, let alone in the basement itself. Shortly after this, maybe after 6 months of living in the house, Jay and they had one final incident that made them move out of the house. I was downstairs doing the dishes and Jay upstairs helping the uncles install some new shelves. She heard Jay walk then into a full run down the stairs toward the basement door. He then slammed the door behind him with such force that the noise made her drop a dish and break it. I yelled at Jay for being a lumbering buffoon and scaring her. Then about 20 seconds later, Jay came down to the same set of stairs and asked if they had fallen down or something because her and the uncles heard all the commotion downstairs. When they realized that Jay was upstairs the whole time, her blood ran ice cold. She then proceeded to tell Jay that someone had run down the stairs and slammed the door shut. The uncles and Jay went to check out the basement and found no one was there. Anyway, they moved out maybe a week or 2 later. The uncles didn't last much longer. They sold the property to a development. Now there's a Tim Horton, Wendy's, Subway built on the old site. A few years later, it was telling one of her co-workers at a new job about what happened. The girl asked where the house was located. Apparently, the girl grew up in that suburb, and the house was famous. An old woman had lived there alone with her cats for years. They found her dead one day in the basement. She had killed herself, and the cats had eaten parts of her. The kids used to dare each other to sneak peek into the basement window. I used to live near a graveyard and would often go over there to be alone. I liked the quiet, and as such, would go there at night too. I'm somewhat into the paranormal, so I decided to go and see if there was a spirit that wanted to talk. I told a few of my friends that they are of the same mindset, and they kept saying how it was a bad idea and how I shouldn't do it. I probably should have listened in hindsight. I went to the graveyard about 2:45 in the morning and waited. Walked around a bit, sat in my favorite spot, etc., etc. Once the new hour came up, I went to the middle of the graveyard and started asking questions. Simple things like, is anyone here that would like to speak? Why are you still here? If someone is here, can you give me a sign? And the like. I did this for about 10 to 15 minutes before trying the oh-so-smart tactic of making them angry. Now I'm ranting about how cowardly they are, weak-willed, and a bunch of other stuff. And then the laughter came, maybe 10 feet ahead of me, and slightly to the left was where it was coming from. And it wasn't just silly or creepy laughter. It was, I'm going to scalp you and eat the gooey deliciousness that resides within before slurping on your marrow, sort of laughter. Needless to say, I got out of there. I slowed down with my house in sight, thinking I was safe, since I was out of the graveyard. Nope. The laughter came back again, just over my shoulder. So, I decided running was a good option. Got home and went to sleep. Friends the next day saw me, and without asking me said, "You pissed something off, didn't you?" Apparently it was pretty obvious. Some nights later, as I was walking my dog, I heard some crazed giggling coming from an empty hill. Sometimes I get the feeling that whatever was following me, the laughter was too deep for a female, came with me when I moved, and when I came back to the state this all happened. I was on holiday a couple of years ago. By the time we got our rental car and left the airport, it was probably 2 a.m. We were going to a friend's parents' holiday home. She'd been loads of times but never did the drive herself. Anyway, we turned off the way too early and ended up going pretty far up a muddy back road. It was pitch black, literally just the lights from the car, and she was struggling to turn around because the tires kept digging into the mud. So, there we are in the pitch black, 3 girls alone in a country where none of us really spoke the language. And in the rearview mirror, we see a set of headlights getting closer. So, we start panicking, thinking it's like the start of every horror movie we've ever seen. The lights were getting closer and closer, tires digging in, 3 girls all freaking out. Then the other car stopped right behind us. A guy got out and walked over to our car. Turned out to be a super friendly English-speaking police officer who knew exactly where we were going and drove in front of us the rest of the way to get us to our destination. In the 70s, my wife and I raised our first litter of Springer Spaniels. They were so cute. To be sold as AKC pups, they had to have their tail docked. The vet said snip them off with scissors a day or 2 after they are born. He said they will hardly notice, and the snip will seal off with almost no blood. So, my wife did the first one. The puppy yipped horribly, like it had just been hit by a car or something, and crawled about bleeding profusely from its tail wound. I said, "I can't do that," but my wife insisted that she had done it and so must I. So I did. It was horrible, and in the many litters later, I always sold pups with tails, but the weird thing was that in this litter of 8, we had cut off only 2 tails. When we checked the litter later, there were 3 pups without tails. Neither of us had cut off the 3rd pup's tail. No one else was there to do it. Yet it was gone. I was home alone for about 6 days at that time, and I, as any lazy-ass student, didn't have anything to eat at home, so I went to a nearby McDonald's drive-in. At 2 a.m., the area where the drive-in is a big area of the city with a bunch of stores. It's basically a bunch of halls full of various stores, about 500 of them, and various entertainment venues like cinema, go-karts. Usually it's all lit up at night and moderately full of people who go clubbing and having fun. But since it was Tuesday night, it was empty and all the street lights were shut off, which is pretty unusual. I'm driving through the area. The drive-in is on the other side, and I see someone walking or standing in the middle of the road. He had dark tracksuit pants and a dark jacket and a white sweater underneath, so he was pretty hard to see in the dark surroundings. I switched my headlights on long beams, and I saw that this guy was slowly shambling towards my car like a zombie. And he was bloody like one, blood around his mouth, dripping on the ground in front of him. He was slouched and held his arm across his stomach underneath a dark blot which seemed like a stab wound. I stopped the car, and as he approached, I let the window down a few centimeters, knowing that the car is locked. It locks itself after a few meters of driving. Whatever happened, I should have prepared. I had my phone ready to call an ambulance, but I also kept my car in first gear, so I could leave if necessary. So, the guy finally comes to the driver's side and leans on the car and immediately says, with a heavy immigrant accent, "Come on, you'll drive to XYZ," referring to a poor district at the other side of the town. I was caught completely off guard and just stuttered, "W what?" He quickly replied, "I said drive to XZ," with an angry tone. Then the instincts kicked in, and I just drove off. He left a big, bloody handprint on the window and a lot of little drops of blood on the whole side of the car. So I immediately, while still completely in shock, started cleaning the car with those wet paper towels on the parking lot of MCD. After that, I thought about contacting the police, but usually it just brings up more problems here, and the anonymous calls aren't. I went to the drive-in and waited to get my order, and I saw a figure slowly shambling a few dozen meters ahead of me. He went to the bus stop, which is about 50 meters from MCD, and after very intense 5 minutes, a cab came and picked him up. I used to stay at my grandma's house a lot as a kid. After my grandpa died when I was 7 years old, I started feeling uneasy every time I stayed there. It wasn't anything in particular that I would get freaked out about. It was just this overwhelming sense of something bad inevitably happening there. Regardless, there were still quite a few nights I made it through without my parents having to come pick me up. I also had a tendency to wake up in the middle of the night as a kid. Every single night at my house, I would get up, see if my parents would let me in their room, and if they wouldn't, I would stand at the top of the stairs and stare into the darkness just waiting for something to move or someone to start walking up the steps. I was an anxious child. Anyway, I woke up at my grandma's house one night a year or so after my grandpa had passed. I was against one wall in a twin bed. My brother would be next to me in another bed, and on the opposite wall was a small collection of dolls and crafts. The two most prominent dolls were Raggedy and Raggedy Andy. Obviously, they freaked me out. Anyway, I woke up and started to go get my grandma to see if she'd go down to the bathroom with me. As I'm walking out of the room, I turn around and notice Raggedy and is waving at me with her head tilted to the side. I said no and went into my grandma's bedroom as fast as I could, leaving my brother to fend for himself. Despite being the sweet and compassionate lady she is, she refused to get up and check because, well, she's also a very logical person. I slept under the covers in her bed that night. I'm 22 now, and it's been 14 years since it happened to me. I still think of it every time, and I see that doll every time I go upstairs to my grandma's house. It has never moved again. Even though I want to believe it was a dream or something like my family says, I really just can't believe it. I was an anxious child, but I know what I saw. The only thing I can think of is when my friends and I drove back home after an all-day visit to Carowinds. We're all exhausted, and one friend who actually had a license said he was too tired to drive. So, I had to take the wheel at age 16 of a car I don't own and without a license. Naturally, I don't want to get pulled over for anything, so I drive the speed limit. There are barely any cars on the road because it's 1 a.m. on a Monday night. This was summer break. At some point, we hadn't seen a single car for 20 minutes or so. A van comes up and starts riding my ass. I'm in the right lane, no traffic. I started freaking out because I think it's an undercover police officer trying to push me into doing something stupid, sheltered teenager thinking. But he just keeps on my ass, and I wake up my friends who are unnerved now. Then, the van suddenly gets into the passing lane and blazes by us. I feel relieved when I see his taillights brighten about where he's about to disappear behind the horizon line. He has pulled off onto the road. We passed him. The van gets back on the road. Now he's not tailgating me, but staying a good distance away. We're freaking out at this point, and there's not much else on the road. We also have to pee. Eventually, we see a sign for a rest stop, so we pull in. So does the van. We don't get out. No one in the van gets out. We really have to pee. Luckily, there is a smattering of cars and people at this rest stop, so we decide to go to the bathroom in pairs. One group watches the van, the other goes to the bathroom. When all of us go, no one still has gotten out of the van. We sat in the parking lot for a while and waited for a car to pull out of the rest stop. We follow, so at least if something happens, maybe that driver will see it. Fortunately, the van doesn't follow, and we get home fine. True story. My father was on the borough council in our municipality. It is suburban and country, no town or village. On day, he decided to take our old car out for a ride and investigate a resident that was trouble, had the police officers called numerous times. Well, we rode to the spot, and there are two trailers. Both were older, but one was really poor, and the one to its right was more respectable, like working-class people. We stopped and got out for a look around. The decent people came out to talk and opened up when my dad introduced himself. Short story is that these decent neighbors had to call the police officers on their neighbors as they heard a woman screaming and crying. She was old, and her two redneck sons were abusive. They were hulking thugs, and the neighbors dared not confront them. The degenerates carried knives and pistols on their hips. Anyway, more than one night the mother would scream, "Leave me alone. Just give me back my underwear," etc. The police find her naked in a trailer full of garbage. She has maggots living under her breasts. There is a dog carcass rotting in the living room. She is taken away to the home, but the men are still free. While my dad was having this lengthy conversation, I wandered over towards the trailer. I see a fridge on the porch. On top is a rib cage, presumably from the dog. I couldn't wait to get the hell away before the men came home. I am not a superstitious person by any stretch of imagination, but this happened to me last night, and I swear every word of it is true. I was having a nightmare. In my dream, I was walking along a street in my city when a passing-by stranger asked me a question. I didn't quite understand what he said, so I approached him. But soon as I was in arm's reach from him, he stuck me with a needle and injected me with something making me pass out. Still in my dream, I regained consciousness in a dungeon in hell, surrounded by supernatural demons and horror movies. I was stretched out on a torture rack while they flayed my skin to prepare my soul for sacrifice to the devil. There is no escape, the demons told me as they laughed. There is no escape. I screamed and pulled on my chains to escape, but my futile efforts were only met with cackling laughter. Ding dong. I awoke to the sound of my doorbell ringing. Not in the dream. In reality. At 5 o'clock in the morning, it was still dark as night in my apartment. Horrified, I thought this couldn't possibly be the case. I live alone, and I'm certainly not expecting somebody this late on a Saturday night / this early on a Sunday morning. But the doorbell rang again, ding dong. I grabbed my flashlight, bolted out of bed, and went to the front door to investigate. No one was there, not a soul on my porch. It was still dark outside, and the street was deserted. I looked through the large glass window of the front door, but every bone in my body was screaming at me to not open that door. So, behind the door I stayed. I stood there for several minutes wondering what just transpired, looking out onto my empty porch through the window. It was raining slightly cold and generally unpleasant out, certainly not the weather nor time for ding-dong ditching. Besides, there's no way they ran away that fast, right? Maybe my doorbell was malfunctioning, but it only rang those 2 times. Oh well, I thought, and I walked back up the stairs and into my apartment. As soon as I closed my apartment door behind me, the doorbell rang again. Ding dong, ding dong, ding dong. 3 times in rapid succession, as if someone were desperately trying to get me to come downstairs. I raced back downstairs again in a panic, thinking, what is going on? Within 3 seconds, I was back at the front door of my building again, looking at a completely silent and empty porch. Oh, hate this, I thought, and went back upstairs and switched off my doorbell ring. It was difficult to fall asleep again. Me, my ex, and some friends were coming back from somewhere out of town. I forget exactly where, but we stopped at a closed gas station in a desolate area on the Interstate 30M from town. We stopped to see if the outside restrooms were open. We pull around to the back, and there is this guy, wearing a respirator and goggles, no vehicles at all in the lot. He was also wearing rather unclean-looking clothes and yellow dish gloves. When we pulled around, he was pushing a shipping about half full of stuff, didn't get a good look. Seeing us, he stops pushing the cart and rushes towards us at full speed. I didn't stop and got out of there as quickly as possible. The station is at least a mile from exits or other locations, surrounded by various fields and farms. With no vehicle suggesting he was a cleaner of some sort, and his very strange demeanor made it extremely disconcerting. Never figured out what it may have been, nor why he ran after the car. It just felt extraordinarily uncomfortable. The same ex was in Atlanta with her sister and sister's boyfriend at a Braves game. Leaving them made a wrong turn down one way in a bad part of town. Apparently, there was a group of people beating another guy, kicking, bats, etc. They just sat their doors locked while this continued. After it ended, the guy wasn't moving and they drove in, fairly shell-shocked at what they'd seen and how those responsible acted, as if they weren't even there while they beat the guy to what looked death. I wanted to go there for that, but she sent me a picture text with the group around the guy as it was happening. For the past 3 years, I have been volunteering at my local community police station. As it is a community station, the constables assigned to it don't have a car, we don't have storage lockers, and we don't have holding cells. As a volunteer, I mainly handle minor collisions, thefts under $5,000, lost/stolen item reports, and vandalism. When people come in with a found item like a purse or wallet, we search through it, make notes of its contents, and input the file into the system. Midsummer last year, it was a particularly slow Friday afternoon, worked the 3 to 7 p.m. shift, which is when it closes, when an older gentleman walks in to report a found handbag. We took down his info, where he found it in a nearby parking lot, and sent him on his way. The constable gave me permission to look through it. When I opened it, I was surprised to find it filled with small pieces of paper. On each piece was a first and last name with a phone number on the back. In total, I counted 118 people/numbers. The only other content was a wallet. Inside was but a picture of 3 Caucasian females, 2 being young, between 4 and 8, and the third appearing in her early 30s. On the back of that picture were only 2 first names, apparent by their placements on the back of the people they potentially belonged to. Caitlin was written on the back of the adult, Sarah on the youngest-looking child, and the word pickup crudely written on the other child. So, it being a particularly slow day, I took it upon myself to call all the numbers on those pieces of paper. Sure enough, each number belonged to the name paired with it, but no one knew of the 3 in the photos. Now let that sink in. Think about your own life and the people you know. I'm not saying that these people didn't know a trio with these names. I'm saying none of the people I contacted knew of any single mother of 2. Not one. I did in fact make an effort to contact all 118 people. However, about 1/3 of the numbers weren't in service, and about 30 didn't answer their phone. I also tried asking every odd person if they knew any of the people I had been calling, not listening to everyone obviously, just a random handful. No dice. My constable submitted the description of the bag and wallet into the system and held on to it for about a month. We and a few other volunteers made our own little project to try and connect with the people together, but eventually we gave up, closed the file, and threw out the bag. To this day, we're all baffled by how none of the people in the bag held any connection to each other. No family relation, criminal backgrounds, or vehicle similarities. At best, a few shared the same community, and we never found out who the 3 in the photo were. I used to live in a house that had some interesting things happening. We moved in when I was in 5th grade. The man we bought it from hadn't wanted to move out, but his wife had inherited another home, so they were moving into that. The upstairs hadn't been finished. It was comprised of stud walls with a few pieces of sheetrock hung every so often, and various chunks of insulation, wood, and other debris scattered on the floor. It had been an unusual find, and my parents were thrilled with it, though the man routinely gave them trouble in the process of selling the house. My parents asked him to discard the garbage upstairs before we moved in. My brother arrived to find the man ripping the small amount of sheetrock and insulation from the upstairs out and burning it in the backyard. We also found out he had shoved human feces down the air vents once we'd moved in. I'd always disliked the house. It was noisy. When we first moved in, my mom complained of things sounding like they'd fallen from the shelves and shattered, only to run into the room and find everything intact. I was present one of these times, so I know she was telling the truth. Besides, my mother isn't one to make things up. I would wake up most nights at about 2 or 3 a.m. in footsteps and would cower in my bed, imagining a burglar was in our home. My bedroom was situated on the corner wall between the entrance to the house and the living room, so I heard everything. It seemed the footsteps got worse when we finished upstairs and I moved into my brother's room. He took my parents and they moved upstairs. I was then underneath the living room, which had previously been the room so stripped of its sheetrock. I would tell myself it was the dog walking around, until one night I snuck him into my room to keep me company and still was woken to footsteps. Things seemed to get better for a little while, until one night before a long-anticipated trip I woke up once again at approximately 4 a.m. I headed a hushed hissing just over the bubble of my aquarium. I told myself I just needed to add more water and try to go to sleep. It got louder. Now I am picturing burglars again, but as I was almost in 8th grade, I decided I should be brave. If there were burglars, I decided I would pull out my hand-to-hand combat skills learned in watching too many Star Trek away missions. I got up and opened the door to my hallway. The sound got louder. I walked down the hallway to the living room, stepping as quietly as possible. The sound was now audible whispers. I could make out words like she and it. It was 2 people having a conversation around the corner that held the stairway leading upstairs. The stairway had a solid wall and originally a door to go to it, but the door had been turned into an arch. The stairway ran up the back wall of the living room. Our dog was lying on his bed and only sat up when I walked in. I sat down on the couch as quietly as possible, my heart beating out of my chest, my courage failing me. Our dog got up and rested his head on my lap, and I held on to him for dear life. The whispering kept up. Finally, mustering up my courage, I got up and took the few steps to the arch, turning the corner to see a pitch-black but entirely empty stairway and silence. The voices stopped. I stayed at the top of the stairs until my mom found me that morning, too scared to go back to bed and too proud to wake my parents. I had a few less than happy memories of things happening in that house. A horse in the field belonging to our neighbors died a horrible death, and that neighbor completely lost his mind. The house next to it was infamous for breaking up marriages, and the 1800 farmhouse on the side of my bedroom could only keep tenants for a few months at a time before eventually becoming abandoned. So really the entire area was odd. Not to mention the couple of times sneaking out that I cut through the backyard of the abandoned house, only to find finger-shaped bruises on my arms and legs. I'd growl at go while waiting in the dark for my bus, and my mom saw a shadow walk down the hallway and down the stairs in the middle of the night. I just consider whispering to be the most frightening because it was the beginning. I'm still worried, though. My parents still live in the house. When I was around 12 years old, my friend had invited me to stay over for his birthday. He lived near an orchard field in Yakima, Washington. My brother came with me, 14, and a few other friends. We watched a movie, ate cake, etc., and it started to get pretty late. My friend's dog ran away a couple of days back, and I brought up the idea of looking for him that night since we had a few people. We also like to run around and explore, so I thought this would be fun. We got some flashlights and binoculars and started into the orchard/forest. We went from the road onto some beaten trails and then deeper into the orchard where there was a creek and hills on the other side. At this point, we were just walking and talking, and then I saw something out of the corner of my eye, like someone standing on top of the hill. I pulled out the binoculars, and when I looked again, it was running down the hill right towards us. It was huge. It looked furry but was standing on two legs. I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, but I saw that the tall grass it was running on was being flattened behind him. I couldn't believe it, so I gave the binoculars to my brother and told him to look. He grabbed the binoculars and looked up for about 5 seconds, dropped the binoculars on the ground, and ran straight back to the house. Didn't even say one word, just ran as fast as he could back to the house. I am 22 now, and he is 24. Sometimes we talk about it. Our mom likes to bring it up. We don't know what it was, but we both agree it wasn't human. When I was 7 and my sister was 8, we were allowed to go down the street to the park, which was right down the street from my house and right next to a church. Now, we went frequently, but had to keep our eyes peeled for things like broken beer bottles, needles, that kind of dirt, and don't poke at the drunks in the bushes. We were also told to run. If a black Lincoln Town car came near asking for help, adults don't ask kids to help unless they want to grab them. Here? I shouted at it once. I was pretty plucky for a poor kid. I didn't exactly live in a nice part of town. We were crawling in the bushes looking for drunk change. The nickels and dimes that roll out of a really drunk person's pockets add up if you look carefully. To go buy some cheap candy at the convenience store when we heard a man's voice coughing, crying, and it sounded like he was pleading. He was curled up beside the church. Couldn't have been too far into adulthood, but he was so cut up his face had very few discernible features except the tears streaking the dried blood. And he was coated in dirt and blood. He was shaking, hard, begging the wall of the church to help him. Blue plaid flannel and really gunky black jeans. All over black, brown runnels of dried blood and small cuts, one bad one on his leg. I'm guessing he lost a lot of blood. He was reeked. We went over, and my older sister told me to stay with him. She was going for help. We helped him get to the front of the church, but it was midweek in the summer. They weren't open. So I sat with this trembling, weeping young man, keeping my hands to myself since he was oozing from cuts everywhere and repetitively telling him help was coming. She went home and forgot about me. The old woman in the divided house on the corner called the police because she recognized me, but not the hunched mess I had helped get to the front door of the church. Eventually, the police officers came, told me to go home, and he was put into the back of a car. I don't know what happened to him, but I do know it was a local gang that did it to him. From his garbles, he was apologizing constantly. He was probably pretty deep in shock. We went to the park the next day, and the hedges we had been crawling through the day before had been chopped down. Most lower limbs of the pine trees also got lopped off, so the drunks and gang members couldn't hide in them at night anymore. So, the most sad, disturbing story I have in my childhood would be this one. I'd never seen an adult male cry or be so broken before or since gang violence is terrifying. We never talked about it again, but it took a week for them to get around to spraying the dried blood off the building, so it was pretty bad. When I was little, around the age of 12, I was home alone with only my golden doodle. In our basement, we have these double doors that when you close them make a very distinct sound. Anyways, I was just down there playing video games, and I knew I had left the doors open. As I was on our first floor watching TV, I hear the double doors slam shut. Being the curious person that I am, I went to investigate. The double doors are right at the bottom of the stairs to the basement. I slowly crept around the corner and looked downstairs. The doors were shut. At this point, I start freaking out, but I still want to know what happened. So I do the only logical thing and grab my airsoft gun to go investigate. I creep down the stairs slowly with my dog, Bentley, next to me. I posted a pic of him on our Slash if you want to see. Once I find the underlying cause of the stairs, I kick open the double doors and my dog goes running inside sniffing around. After about 30 seconds, I figured it must be clear and go in myself. In the back corner of my basement, we have this huge window that has a ladder type thing to get to the ground floor. The window was wide open. So long story short, I call my mom and she calls the police and they figure it must have been an intruder or something. Shortly after that incident, my parents had cameras installed around the house.
Thanks for watching. Please comment, like, share and subscribe. The Internet Surfer on YouTube for more horror and scary stories.